Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew McFarlane. I'm the Chief External Relations Officer for Payments Canada, and we're delighted to welcome you to the Payments Canada Summit. I'm joined this morning and so happy to be joined by Abraham Tachjian, Canada's newly appointed Open Banking Lead. Abraham, good morning.
Good morning, Andrew. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about open banking in Canada. I look forward to our discussion.
So delighted to have you. Just a reminder that we are live at the summit this morning, so there's an opportunity to ask the speakers. That functionality is present within your platform there, so please take advantage of that. So Abraham, first question for you this morning. Let's start looking globally, and then we'll come back to Canada. In other jurisdictions, we've certainly seen open banking models that have been regulatory-led or market-led. In Canada, we've got a unique hybrid solution. Can you talk to us briefly about how that came about and what's so unique about our landscape in Canada?
Sure, Andrew. And I have to say, I love this question because it's important to look at what's happened in other jurisdictions. There's a wealth of experience that we can be inspired from and look at what we can import to Canada to make our system more successful and effective. So I really want to make our project as pragmatic as possible. So I don't hide my intentions of looking elsewhere. Now, when we talk about experiences of other jurisdictions, I think it's important to appreciate the context in which their systems were developed. Take the UK, for instance, where open banking came up in the context of a regulatory issued retail banking report, where certain banks were deemed to have a quote unquote adverse effect on competition. No doubt a major contributor to taking a regulatory approach. We don't have that here, thankfully. And similarly in Australia, the system developed in parallel to a royal commission looking at misconduct in the banking sector. Now, it's not the exclusive cause, but it's difficult to deny the impact given the severity of such an investigation. And even elsewhere, where a purely market-driven approach took hold, there was still government involvement in the form of policy objectives or other motivating factors. Now, our landscape is quite different. We don't have similar drivers. Our focus is to improve the financial outcomes of consumers. That's what we mentioned in the advisory committee report. So our Made in Canada approach will reflect that. Now, going back to your question, during our industry consultations in November and December of 2020, we had some competing thoughts with respect to how our Canadian system should be set up. We had a certain group of stakeholders who preferred a purely market-driven approach, whereas others preferred a purely regulatory-driven approach. And what I think we could be most proud of is that the advisory committee approach struck a balance, a compromise, if you wish, in the sense that it recognized the opportunity for the industry's involvement from an implementation and an expertise perspective, but at the same time gave an opportunity for the government to set policy objectives. So that Made in Canada approach is reflected in our document, in the advisory committee report, where we try to maintain that compromise and maintain the balance. So as we go forward, we will drive the implementation of our system based on this hybrid Made in Canada approach to eventually have a system that we could be very proud of on a global level.
I think it's absolutely spot on. And I think when we think about open banking in Canada, we did have the rare occurrence of both political parties wanting to push open banking during the last election campaign. Not often you see that within the Canadian landscape. Why do you think that was the case?
Well, Andrew, I think it speaks to the growth of our technology and innovation sector as a whole when fintech slips into a party's political platform. So from that perspective, we're definitely doing something right in Canada. Now, I just spoke about context, but let's bring it up again. The work of the advisory committee took place in the early days of COVID, where Canadian businesses were going through very difficult times, Canadians as well. And the report does not ignore this fact. In fact, the committee clearly stated that open banking would help Canadians and small businesses better recover from a pandemic. So as COVID continued to affect the lives of all Canadians during the elections, it's no surprise that political parties gave a nod to open banking in their campaigns as a means to help Canadians better recover by offering them safer and secure and new innovative products to help them recover from the tough economic times imposed by COVID. But I also think it's important to give consumers credit. Now, it's no secret that they're already using some form of open banking. I mean, we wouldn't call it that. It's essentially screen scraping, right? Which may not be the safest way to share data, where credentials are exchanged with a third party who pretends to be a consumer for the purpose of pulling data from a financial institution. So that's already happening. And so I think the parties realized that setting a more secure framework around this would be beneficial to all Canadians, as well as our financial system. So I think between the backdrop of COVID and a quite sophisticated Canadian consumer, political parties realize that this is something that needs to be addressed and needs to be focused on.
You talk about, you mentioned sort of consumer and small business demand, and today we're talking at the Payments Canada Summit. So let's talk payments just briefly. Do you think that payments initiation will eventually be in scope for the Canadian open banking model?
That's a great question, Andrew. And I'll be blunt. If we want open banking to be successful in Canada, it has to be. And I'd say look no further than in the UK. It's no coincidence that the adoption numbers of open banking have increased exponentially over the last few months as payment initiation has become more common. In fact, I would encourage any listener that has an interest in payments or a remote interest in open banking to pay close attention to those monthly figures as an indication of the potential of open banking. What we saw in the UK in terms of early adoption was perhaps tepid, to put it mildly. But as payment initiation was made available and new products around that started to be introduced, there was a significant uptick, particularly in the last couple of months, and where if this momentum continues, the adoption figures will be quite impressive. So I really see the payments aspect, the right aspect, if you like, in technical jargon of open banking, being a huge success factor for open banking in Canada. And now, going back to the advisory committee's report, now, although it states that the initial phase of our work should focus on read access in the sense of only pulling data, and write access being tabled for down the road, including payment initiation, should come as a subsequent phase. I don't think there's any reason why we can't at least start looking at how we can set the infrastructure today for a future system to come. Now, how can we do that? Well, as part of my work over the next 18 months, I'll work with the industry to set up some of the pillars of our open banking regime, be it accreditation, common rules, and the technical standards. And when we talk about accreditation, we could start looking at how we can facilitate payment initiation somewhere down the road. Let's say we have third parties that want to eventually have access to the system. And I suspect that many of the parties that will go through accreditation have a strong interest in payments, right? They'll be payment service providers. So we can engage those companies early in the discussions to get their views on how we can develop the system, even a future system. We can look at how we can incorporate accreditation requirements specific to payment parties while we do the work now. We can also take inspiration from the work that the government is doing already with respect to payment legislation. And I refer to the Retail Payments Activities Act that was passed last year. That's legislation that's already existing with the regulations in the work now. So there's a lot of infrastructure that we can inspire ourselves from as myself and the industry work together to develop our regime over the next 18 months. There's no sense in waiting. Perhaps we wait to actually implement this down the road, as the report indicates. But we have an opportunity here to seize the momentum of this exercise to at least start looking at how we can facilitate the exercise down the road.
Completely agree. And even the fact that it's under the one minister with Minister Boissonneau having control for payments modernisation and open banking really just shows the importance that the government is placing on those two key initiatives for the economy.
Absolutely, quite serendipitous.
Just sort of another related policy question. So there's often a strong linkage in other jurisdictions between privacy and open banking. So let me ask you, is the success of open banking in Canada, is it dependent on privacy legislation being passed in advance of open banking being introduced? Do you think there's such a clear linkage in Canada?
That's a good question. Dependent? No. An accelerant? Definitely. Let's look at it from a timing perspective. I think there's general acknowledgement within the industry that Canada needs to move forward relatively fast with open banking in order to maintain its competitiveness on a global stage. We've seen many other jurisdictions, including in Latin America over the last year, implement open banking regimes. So we have to work hard to develop ours as well. Now, we also need to keep up, right? From a global perspective as well. So our timeline speaks to that. It's quite aggressive, but it's with the interest of catching up. So waiting on privacy legislation to be implemented before tackling open banking, I believe, would be a mistake. Next, on data privacy, well, it's definitely an accelerant to open banking in that it enshrines a consumer right to data mobility and data portability. And as I understand it, Minister Champagne has clearly said that the privacy legislation is on the top of his priority list, which is a real plus to open banking. However, given that the industry wants to establish an open banking system in Canada, I think we can move ahead with the development of the regime, the system, while the privacy legislation goes through the process of being adopted. I don't think anybody needs to be strong-armed to be convinced that consumers have the right to their data. And finally, it's not like the open banking system will ignore privacy requirements. In fact, it's one of the key pillars of the system that we will implement as we describe it under the common rules of the advisory committee's report. It's one of the foundational elements of open banking. And for example, we'll look at visibility with respect to who has access to consumer data, when they have access to it, and for how long. All these elements of privacy will be baked into our open banking regime. And there's also the accreditation bit, the other structural foundational piece. And we'll look at privacy practices of third parties that want to be members of this ecosystem to be able to have access to their consumers' data on their consumers' consent. So although I believe that privacy legislation is a huge contributor to the advancement of open banking, I think the work can definitely run in parallel so that we can come to a point where both regimes are running successfully at the same time.
Makes perfect sense. Good answer. So we're nearing the end of our chat, and just again a prompt to our delegates who are watching this morning, please enter your questions into your Ask the Speaker functionality, and we'll probably have time for one or two questions at the end. But Abraham, in terms of understanding the timing for open banking in Canada, certainly the timeline, there's no doubt it seems pretty aggressive. So is it achievable?
Well, Andrew, of course it's aggressive, but that's a good thing. Sometimes tight deadlines have a way of making us work with a little more seriousness, urgency. I mean, you get it. And the reason behind that, as I mentioned, is because there's so much interest from consumers to share data with third parties and for us to be able to maintain our competitiveness on a global stage. So I welcome the aggressiveness. And it's definitely achievable because we're not starting from scratch, Andrew. The industry, they've put a lot of effort over the last couple of years in laying some of the foundational groundwork around open banking, be it with data sharing agreements with online accounting software providers, the FDX consortium that's looking at technical standards, API portals, digital ID projects. It's not like we're summoning the industry to start work from scratch, right? There's a lot of good effort. There's a lot of momentum that's already there that we can use as an accelerant, again, to drive our work forward. And all this muscle memory that's developed within the industry around the topic has actually helped clarify some of the issues that stakeholders can bring to our discussions. So I think it's definitely achievable in the sense that, we're not starting from scratch. And there's already a lot of attention that's being paid, both from a consumer perspective, from a fintech perspective, and a financial institution perspective. And most importantly, I'd say there's a general consensus to move this forward. If we go back a couple of years, I recall the conversation around open banking would focus more on the ways it would go wrong, right? And I think we've passed that conversation. I think a lot of the stakeholders now look at this as a really good opportunity to serve their clients better and to increase the financial welfare of Canadians. So I think in terms of timing, we're in a perfect situation in the sense that we can learn from what other jurisdictions have done. And we've got a lot of interest from numerous stakeholders to drive this forward. So although it is an aggressive timeline, I definitely think it's achievable.
That's terrific to hear. Thank you. So final question, and then we'll go to some audience questions. So you've got a huge number of delegates, and thank you to all the delegates who have joined the Payments Canada Summit this year. We're delighted to have you. You've got a number of people really interested in your views. So what's your immediate next steps? And you must have a call to action. So be delighted to hear that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, as much as I personally and professionally am passionate about the topic, I can't do this alone. Thankfully, I have a great secretariat within the Department of Finance that is helping me drive this forward. And over the next couple of months, we're working together to set up the infrastructure and the governance around how we will engage with the numerous voices in the industry. I spoke earlier about the hybrid model of our system in the sense that both government and the industry have a role to play, and I will stick by that. We will have working groups coming up very shortly. We'll have roundtables coming up this week where we'll kickstart the conversation. And so my call to action to the industry is familiarize yourself with the advisory committee's report. Start thinking about all the ways that you can develop new innovative products to contribute to the financial health of Canadians, and get ready for the work that we have ahead. It's an aggressive timeline. There's a lot of heavy lifting to do, but I'm confident that working together with the industry, that we'll reach our timeline and have a system, as I mentioned, that we can all be proud of.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Let's go to a couple of audience questions, and it ties in with the innovation piece you just brought in. So we have a question from Laurie from Prospera Credit Union. And Laurie's delighted with your appointment and asks, what's the most innovative use case that you're excited about that open banking will enable?
Well, that's a great question, Laurie. Thank you. I touched on this briefly. It's with respect to the payment side, right? Now, although it's down the road, I'm quite encouraged at the adoption level that comes with payment initiation and right access. Because one of my concerns is that the industry works very, very hard over the next 18 months to develop a system that we can be proud of. And then the adoption levels kind of stagnate. Consumers don't really care about it. Not that consumers need to know exactly how open banking works, but the products that come with it will speak to the innovation, will speak to the adoption. So I'm really, really encouraged as to what I'm seeing with respect to right access and how it can increase adoption. But generally, at the stage that we're now, it's not like we can't have innovative products from a data perspective. I think giving a better financial snapshot of Canadians is a huge plus, and I'm very excited to see that, to allow consumers to be able to have perhaps a single portal where they can have access to all of their financial assets, liabilities, allow them to better plan financially for their household. So I think there's numerous opportunities, and I can't wait to see what's ahead.
Completely agree. Very excited. We have an anonymous question, so it's a slightly tricky one.
Those are the best ones.
Thought I'd throw that at you. So have you seen open banking being politicized in other jurisdictions, and how can Canada avoid this happening?
That's a great question. Well, look, I wouldn't use the term politicized, but as I refer to the UK and Australia, there was a lot of parallel work that was happening in the background that contributed to some of the requirements of their system. So I wouldn't use that moniker, but we can't ignore the amount of attention that went into the Royal Commission in Australia, as well as the regulatory retail banking report in the UK. Now, here in Canada, I think we have a consensus among the industry that we need to move this forward, which encourages me that we don't really need to be concerned with that. I've yet to speak to a single stakeholder that isn't as excited about this as I am to move this forward. So I'm encouraged as to where we are in the industry and how we will progress this.
Abraham, your excitement comes through, and we're so delighted to have you in role. We're delighted to see the traction that you're going to get in the next number of weeks with your workshops and everything else that's coming up. So thank you. Thank you for spending time this morning at the Payments Canada Summit. And we're delighted to have you here. And please enjoy, for the delegates, please enjoy the rest of the summit. So Abraham, thank you so much.